And now PIX is threatened, PIX is going to end. What's happening with PIX? So let's understand this. Why could the United States decision about the PCC and Comando Vermelho affect PIX banks and companies in Brazil? Let's go. What's happening? The sanctions imposed by the United States are arbitrary. That country has terrorists because I just classified it as such, right? The United States itself classifies Brazil as terrorists. So a country that has terrorists can be treated anyway. It's enough, as I said, for them to get suspicious of a bank, a fintech, an entity, an institution, or any Brazilian and say, you're suspected of being a terrorist, I'm not going to do business with you. And they have an interest in taking down PIX, as you know, because PIX gets in the way of credit cards, you know, the American credit card companies. They're eager to put an end to PIX. So what can they do? Easily. Force the banks to track the information of their account holders, of the people who use PIX. So, if you didn't like that tracking starting from 5,000 reais, which was already a rule for banks and was just implemented for fintechs, if you believed in Nicholas's fake news that PIX would be taxed, now yes, you will really be monitored for what you do with PIX. Why? Because Brazil made some law? No. Because the United States, they can require banks to strictly monitor PIX transactions. And the bank, since it does business with the United States, since it needs the United States, will do this monitoring. It always comes out as a law in Brazil because it does business with the United States. So this kind of economic pressure, what happens to the guy who is outside the United States, outside Brazil, abroad, wherever he is, wanting to invest money in Brazil and hears, this country has terrorists, the banks become super restrictive, everything is harder to work with in this country, I'm not going there, I'll send my money to another country that's simpler, where it's easier to invest money. Brazil loses investments because obviously investors don't want to invest in a country that has terrorists. So, this classification coming from the United States only harms Brazil economically and in the fight against crime. Because, as I just said, in fighting crime, there isn't that cooperation between Brazil and the United States. The United States starts doing things secretly. Today, there is a partnership between Brazil and the United States. Today, in fighting crime. This partnership ends because everything the United States starts doing against terrorists is secret. So, he doesn't have to say anything. Do you understand? That's the problem. And PIX can end up being heavily monitored. You send 10 reais through PIX and the bank is informing the United States. It's informing the American authorities. Because the bank doesn't want to be sanctioned in the United States. It needs dollars to keep things running. So, it's going to do all the monitoring that Brazilian law doesn't require, but the United States will. Will it take out wine? That's another question too. Will it take out wine? That could be affected. The United States Department denies any attempt to interfere in the elections. The president of Brazil is chosen by Brazilians. Yesterday, those who were here on the live remember that I talked about this. The interference in the elections started with this act of classifying the factions. This act is the first intervention by the United States in the Brazilian election. Because it was a move coordinated with Marco Rubio to boost the candidate. Who is their candidate? Who is the far-right candidate? Right? So that's how Trump acts without showing up. Because it was Marco Rubio who did it. It wasn't Trump. But do you think Marco Rubio does anything without Trump's authorization? Something this important? Of course not. The order to do this came from Trump himself. Why? Where there are terrorists, I can go in, I can send secret agents, I can investigate without anyone knowing. I can put pressure on all the banks, put pressure on the companies. There are companies, poor things, that even have money from a criminal organization passing through them, and the company doesn't know. There's no way to know. Some companies do know. They even help, actually. But there are many that don't know. They're simply financial institutions. So what now? I decided to pick a fight with this bank here, with this fintech here. That's it. It's messed up, right? And this discourages investments in Brazil. Then Amanda Robertson, who's the spokesperson for the State Department, gave an interview to Globo News, was asked about this and said no, that they're not interfering in the elections. She even said that this decision has nothing to do with Flavio's trip to the United States. It's all a staged act to hide the truth. Their little act. No, it wasn't Flavio. Imagine that. This decision had already been made. This decision had already been made and was going to happen anyway. But it's also true that it was arranged to be done at the moment when Flavio was there in the United States to give the impression in Brazil that it was Flavio who made it happen. Because the far right has this stupid idea of labeling a criminal faction as a terrorist organization. Because what do they want? To discredit Brazil. And then, by discrediting Brazil, in their minds, in their little half-witted minds, they discredit Lula. So they discredit everyone, destroy everything, just to discredit the leader. For what? So they can win the election. So, when Dudu Bananinha said back then, if there's a scorched earth scenario, at least I'll feel avenged, he wasn't joking. He was serious. If they have to destroy Brazil, this family will do it. And that's exactly what they're doing now. And this is very serious. Right? PCC and Red Command. Can the United States invade Brazil because of terrorist organizations? Understand this. They can. That's the big problem. They can. There could be aircraft carriers in Guanabara Bay when we least expect it. And what is our ability to react to that? Militarily. Face them with bullets? None. Zero. But that's what's happening. Visas for Brazilians. Look at that. Look, could they be affected by the United States' decision to classify PCC and CV as terrorists? Yes, they could. Right? There was also an interview with a professor, a specialist on Globo News, who said, look, the United States can get suspicious just because of someone's address. The person lives near the Alemão complex. Sometimes they don't even live in the Alemão complex, just nearby. Since the Alemão complex is controlled by the Red Command, the guy at the embassy or the consulate can simply say, no, you're suspected of being a terrorist. I'm not going to give you a visa. You live in a neighborhood that's controlled by the PCC. When you apply for a US visa, they may ask where you live. If you say your neighborhood and it's on their list as PCC controlled, they might suspect you of being a terrorist. I'm not going to give you the visa indiscriminately, however they see fit, because the country has terrorists, according to how they classified it, and that's it. And then, right, what the reckless Bolsonaro family members keep celebrating. Not just them, others too. A former ambassador fears US interference in the elections. Rubens Barbosa was an ambassador, likely during Fernando Henrique Cardoso's term. And he talks specifically about interference. This interference that's already happening. He says he's afraid this will happen. And I'm saying it's already happening. This gesture from the American government is already interference in the Brazilian election. Because it was a calculated gesture to benefit. Other gestures of this nature will happen. They will come. Count on it. Dudu Bananinha already said there will be more. And do you doubt it? Of course not. Because what's at stake is something very big. What's at stake is Brazilian democracy, a country with 215 million inhabitants. And that's what's at stake right now. Whether this country will remain democratic or if it will become a dictatorship. And who's fighting to establish the dictatorship?